All right. Hey there, folks. Since book tour and conventions are still on a somewhat staggered return, I figured I'd bring book tour to you. So welcome to Russ's Rockin' Rollercoaster, Season 7, Intriguing Interviews with Creative Minds. As I try to do at least once a year, I like to take a deep dive into the abyss. So welcome to Spooky Stories 3. This year is the Women of Dark Fiction and Horror, and I'll be digging into ghouls and ghosts and other terrifying creatures that go bump in the night. With us tonight is my friend CAROL GYZANDER. CAROL is a Bram Stoker Award nominated author who writes and edits horror, dark fiction, and science fiction. Her latest work is a cryptid novella, Forget Me Not, from the System Paradoxa series Neo Paradoxa. Her short stories are in numerous anthologies, including The Yellow Crown and the Stoker nominated weird fiction anthology Under Twin Suns, Alternate Histories of the Yellow Sign. CAROL is also the Horror Writers Association New York chapter co-chair and co-host of the monthly HWA New York Galactic Terrors online reading series. Welcome, CAROL.
Thanks, Russ. I'm delighted to be here.
All right, and before we go any deeper, a huge shout out to CAROL for being nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. Fantastic, congrats, and very well deserved.
Thank you. It was a huge honor just to be nominated, and that made me delighted and happy.
All right, so also on our panel tonight is Amy Grech. Amy has sold over 100 stories to various anthologies and magazines, including A New York State of Fright, Apex Magazine, Flashes of Hope, Gorefest, Hell's Heart, Hell's Highway, Hell's Mall, Microverses, Needle Magazine, Punk Noir Magazine, Tales from the Canyons of the Damned, The One That Got Away, Under Her Skin, and many others. Amy is also an active member of the Horror Writers Association and the International Thriller Writers. Welcome, Amy.
Thanks for having me, Russ. Thrilled to be here.
All right, and finally, welcome my friend and Oreo cookie and Nutter Butter bandit, Heather Hutsell. Heather has written and self-published a dozen novels, 2 novellas, an epic poem, and 4 short story collections. Her works include romantic horror, absurdist fiction, dystopian tales, fairy tales gone awry, and steampunk mystery series. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
All right, good to see you. A little housekeeping before we get started. I just have to let everyone know I had a little bit of an accident earlier this week. My hand got caught in the car door, and there was some concerns about amputation, and they had to rip the fucking thing right off. Oh my goodness. All right, I know I did this sloppy bit last year, so I figured I'd try it again. All right, just a heads up to the folks at home. Feel free to send me notes or questions you may have for me in the panel or the chat box during the show, and we'll get to a few at the end. All right, let's jump in. All right, so there are multiple genres of horror. We got ghosts, we got demons, we got slashers, we got psychological horror, body horror, survival horror, and God knows what else. Tonight, we're going to be looking at dark fiction as a nuanced differentiator from horror. So in your mind, and I'll start with you, Heather, what's the difference between dark fiction and horror?
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot because I thought it was solid in my head until I started looking at the stuff I write and realized there's a lot of crossover. But I would say that one of the big differences between horror and dark fiction is that horror gives you the gore. It gives you the visuals. It gives you the things that you don't want to see. Whereas dark fiction tends to be a lot more internal. It's the stuff that hangs on you. It's the things that are implied but not exactly said. And it leaves a bit more to the imagination.
Amy?
Yes, I would echo that. For me, dark fiction is more bleak, more unforgiving, and horror is more blunt, more direct. There's the more gore, it's right up front. There's nothing hidden, whereas dark fantasy, there might be a slow reveal, a slow burn, if you will.
Okay. What about CAROL? Does that fit your thoughts or?
Yeah, those are good points. And one other thing I think we can think about is the actual setting itself of the 2 different genres. In horror, you've got the intrusion of the frightening and unknown stuff into the everyday world. And that can be pretty scary, but it doesn't have to be supernatural, like a serial killer or something could be the thing causing the horror. But a lot of times in dark fantasies, they are set in more of a fantastic or otherworldly kind of location or setting. Like if you have vampires are considered to be a normal part of your everyday world, then that's a fantasy setting. And that's probably going to be more a dark fantasy kind of story than just specifically horror.
So I may have mentioned this on the show once before, I can't remember. Many years ago, I was actually at the Thriller Writers meeting in New York, and through a friend of mine who was on the author track, invited me to his panels, and I actually got to hang out with David Morrell for a while, the guy who wrote First Blood, the Rambo series, turned out to be the Rambo series, and we were chatting, and he said, he goes, there's really nothing more. There's all sorts of boogeymans and things out there that are scary, but what's scarier, what's spookier than having your next door neighbor come over to have a beer with you and just to hang out, and he's actually the killer.
Ooh, yeah.
Right.
And you've let him into your house. Right?
You've welcomed into your home. You think everything is great, but as the audience, you're starting to realize that this person is not who you thought he was, but you have more information than some of the characters do. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where that sort of dread comes in. So whether that falls under dark fiction, horror, or both, who knows? But in any case, so let me ask you this. What would you say, and maybe we covered it, maybe we didn't, what would you say falls under the subcategory of dark fiction, but not horror? Carol, I'll go back to you.
Well, you could have some kind of a world with a lot of goblins and demons and things like that. But if they're just characters that are taking part in the action, then yeah, that's maybe a dark fantasy, but they don't have to be horrific or terrifying.
Heather?
I think some dark comedy would fit under that, because the comedy aspect sort of neutralizes some of the horror that might otherwise be there.
What do you see as the line, and Amy, I'll continue with you. So just as there's a very fine line, and it's usually tone, in between tragedy and comedy, right? You have someone fall down the stairs and they break their neck in a drama, and it's horrifying. Someone falls down the stairs in a comedy and you hear the Tweety bird, above their heads, and you laugh. But in both cases, they both fallen down the stairs. So where is that line in that sort of dark fiction or horror? What's just on the other side of it not being quote unquote dark? Where is that line? Is it a line? Is it a gray area? Like what is that membrane that separates the two?
I would say it's more of a gray area. And to me, this brings up ghost stories could straddle both worlds, if you will. And I have a story in an anthology coming up that Carol co-edited, Even in the Grave, from Eastbeck Books, being released in July 1st, and James Chambers is the co-editor. And my story, really briefly, they're all ghost stories, and mine is set in a Brooklyn apartment. And some might argue it's urban dark fantasy, and others would say, oh, it's straight up subtle horror. So I think it also goes to the reader's perspective and how they're experiencing the story as well.
So Heather, I know that you having known you for as long as I have, I know kind of the space that you're in. In terms of sort of, staying on this line of this sort of gray area where there's dark fiction. So let's say dark fiction is here and horror is here, but what's on the softer side of dark fiction? What would make it not quite dark? Where's the shade of dark versus not? I mean, you don't have to be dark versus light, but what's dark versus not dark?
I think a lot of it has to do with how the characters are handling the situation. I mean, if they're shuddering in fear, then they're not going to have much of a perspective. It's all going to be, it's going to be too narrow. So there's not going to be room for any gray area. So their attitude, how they handle it, what they do with the situation is going to carry things into a softer side, as you say.
Carol?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think that sometimes in dark fantasy, it's there's monsters and there's supernatural things in the setting, but also the characters who are taking part in it may not be your typical, protagonist who's going to go out and save the world on a hero's journey. They may be an unusual, slightly monstrous person themselves. And I think they have to make the decision about whether they're going to battle the monsters or become one with the monsters. So I think the line there can be, which side is our protagonist going to fall on? I think that shows how dark it may be. If they're really going to fight the monsters, then okay, that's one thing. But if they're going to wind up falling in with them, then that makes it a lot darker.
For sure. I think it's a good point. Sort of, the character's internal mechanisms have a direct correlation on the tone of the setting. But one thing I'm just trying to, maybe I have to rephrase the question. So if you've got, we're sort of talking, at least overtly here, about kind of dark versus horror, but what if we were a step lighter than dark fiction? What would make it sort of not quite dark? It doesn't have to be light and silly, but is there sort of that fuzzy space where it's sort of, if you were just a little more gruesome, it would be dark, but you're not quite there. Is there sort of a shade that's just left of dark?
I'm sure there is. And I think it's also going to depend upon the reader's perspective, because what scares me may not scare you, for example. So I don't think we can put it all in one classification for every single person.
That's true, right? I mean, so that's a good follow-up. Let me go back to all of you. So when you write, since you all write dark fiction and or horror, how much of the reader's own stuff, their own baggage, their own perspectives, are you counting on for them to bring to the story? Because you write the story, right? You have a certain, here are my characters, here's my plot setting, and I know what I want to tell. But there's always sort of an additional character in every story, and that's the audience, because the readers bring themselves into the process. It wasn't part of your process, but it's part of their process, right? The way they're internalizing what we've put on the page. So how much are you sort of counting on them and their own fear centers, their own triggers, to sort of either fill in gaps or add a layer of texture that you just can't do because it's personalized for each reader? Amy.
That's a great question, Russ. For me, I just sort of go where my muse takes me, and I'm along for the ride. And it might be subconscious, but I don't, as I'm writing something, I don't think, oh, I want to trigger this in my reader necessarily. But it usually just flows organically. And if fans meet me in a convention, they'll say, wow, your story in Gore Fest, your take on Russian roulette, I really love the twist. I don't want to ruin it, but things like that.
How much, when you're writing, and this, we'll stay on Amy and then we'll jump around, do you, I think Heather mentioned it earlier about, or I can't remember if it was Carol, about, actions that are unseen. Maybe they're heard, maybe they're implied, there could be, something horrible happened on the other side of the door. Something awful is going on in the next room, a scream comes from a distance. How much of that do you, from an effectiveness standpoint, in terms of getting the reactions from readers that you want, do you look more for the implied that there's something behind, just beyond the barrier, or are you more of, I'm going to show you the killer's doing in the action, the monsters got entrails and blood? Is it, for you, is it more about showing the physicality of the horror, or is it sort of more about implying that something horrible happened or is happening, but I don't need to give you the details, you can figure that out for yourself?
It depends on which subgenre I'm writing in. I've written splatterpunk, ghost stories, dystopian fiction. For my dystopian fiction, that definitely would apply, being more subtle or just implying what happened, like how did everyone get here in this, into this dystopian society. It's something I wrote before the pandemic, just FYI. Whereas my story in Gore Fest, it's very direct just because of the nature of the subgenre.
Mm. Carol?
Well, I tend to write quiet horror or psychological horror. And if you think of Twilight Zone kind of things, everything starts out kind of normal, typical, it's expected, then, oh, that's not quite right. Oh, that's a little weird. Oh, now we're getting there. So I prefer to have the thing sneak up on you, just like even if you think of the movie Jaws, we didn't see the shark until the end. Now it turns out it was because their model wasn't working right and they couldn't get it working till the end. But it was so effective because since we didn't see it, it was more frightening. Yeah, so I like to imply it.
Yeah, we didn't see the monster until halfway through the movie.
Yeah.
We saw what it did, and we saw how the monster affected other people. And I think that's what really made it work, right? Is that we spent an hour with all these disparate characters reacting and responding to this threat, but we never actually saw it.
Right. And it was just building up in the back of your head, like it could be really bad.
And then when it kind of first like showed, it just first comes out of the water and you see the look on Roy Scheider's face and you're like, oh my God.
Yes.
Right. All right. So you all write dark fiction and horror. Do you like to read it and watch it as well? Heather?
I love it, especially if there's a twist. Like, I am not someone who will sit there and try and figure out every little clue and try and work the puzzle as it goes along. I just sit there and flow through it. So, when the big reveal comes and I'm like, I really do get the shock out of it. And I write in the same way. So yes, I love it. I love reading it. I love watching movies that way.
Carol?
Well, I tend to read more than I watch TV or movies just because I have a hard time just sitting still to let the screen wash over me. But audiobooks are my favorite way to consume words. And my favorite thing is short stories, like Ellen Datlow's anthologies of the best horror of the year. Oh my gosh, I learned so much just from listening to those, and they are compelling. They're fabulous.
How about Amy?
Yes, I love to watch horror movies and read horror fiction. In fact, I just saw Crimes of the Future this past weekend. Very wild, good stuff.
So I've said this before on the show several times. I'm not a horror guy. I don't watch it. I don't read it. I'm a scaredy cat. Stuff gives me nightmares. But there's a few classics that I love. Nightmare on Elm Street, American Werewolf in London, and a few others. And I include elements of horror in some of my work, although I'm not a horror writer per se, although some definitely falls under dark fiction. But my question is this. So what is it about horror and dark fiction that appeals to you both as the reader, as a consumer, as the reader, as the watcher? What is it about the darkness, the gruesomeness, the scares? What draws you in as the audience, Carol?
I like to think of it as facing the world as it might really be. If we look only at the happiness and the light and all the good stuff, well, that thing could still be back there behind me and waiting to jump out of the ocean and grab me. So I like being able to confront the unknown and the scary thing in a way that I can deal with it. And that's maybe another reason why I like books better than the movies, because I can put them down if they get too scary. When I watched Poltergeist, I had to leave the lights on in my closet for 2 days after I finished watching it. Yeah.
Oh, God, I had nightmares about that tree for years. Awful. Heather.
I'm sorry, totally blanked on your question.
What is it that you, as the reader, as the consumer, as the audience, why do you like horror, dark fiction? What pulls you in?
One of the reasons I like it is because, we have so many ugly, bleak things happening in the real world. So if I watch something that I know is completely fiction, and I'll just clarify, I don't like slasher films. I don't like things like the Purge, or, things that potentially could happen. So those don't count. But the other ones where they're pretty impossible, then I can step away from that, come back to the real world and think it's just a story. And same with a lot of my writing. Even my horror stuff is pretty fantastical. I mean, we don't have people getting dumped off on other planets just yet, so we're okay there.
Or do we?
Or do we? You never know.
Amy, what kind of, what gets your motor running when it comes to horror?
For me, reading or watching a horror film, it's escapism. It's kind of like a vicarious thrill to be an observer, and it is an adrenaline rush. But as Heather and Carol said, we know that it's not something that's feasible in the real world, and we know it's fiction, and it's just like a great escape for a couple of hours from the real world.
So Heather kind of jumped ahead of me on what she doesn't like. So is there any kind of horror or dark fiction that you don't like, Amy?
I would agree with Heather. I really don't like slasher films. They're kind of an overdone trope.
Carol?
Yeah, I don't love the slasher films and the thing where everybody goes out one at a time into the woods because they're too stupid to stay together. And then they run by the guy with the chainsaw, that kind of stuff is a little obvious. But yeah, I'm not a fan of slasher stuff. Although I do say some body horror stuff is fascinating because it is just so wild. But that's a little different. There's not really a jump scare in there. It's just like, man, this is going a dark place, but I'm kind of holding on.
All right, just a quick interlude for the folks who came in a little late. If you have any questions or comments from me or the panel, send them in a chat box and we'll get to a few at the end of the show. All right, so the last half dozen years and the last two in particular have been a waking nightmare for most of us to varying degrees. Has the pandemic, gun violence, the global and domestic political events going on all around us, have they changed the way that you write in any way? Heather?
Other than getting even more political than I ever was before, like I never intentionally put politics in my story. And in 2012 and 2013, I wrote a dystopian, was futuristic then, but we've been living a bunch of it, a novel called The Quad. And I've been horrified to watch that unfold in real life. Like I didn't mean to do it, but like I've had people who've read it come back to me and say, you put that in your book a couple of years ago. And I'm like, I know.
So this is on you is what you're saying.
Yeah. So I try not to, do too much in that vein, but I will make statements in metaphors, of course, because I don't want to just come right out and be, political. But it has popped up more in my work since the pandemic started.
Carol?
Yeah, I've shied away from writing anything that could be plague or pandemic related because that's always been a great topic. I mean, if you go way back to some of the classics, but it's not what I wanted to write recently.
Does it, I mean, not just in what you're not writing, but does it have the events of the last several years? Do they, whether it's overt or even just from internally, do you find yourself bringing a different kind of style or a different energy or a different type of approach to your work than in the past, or are you just kind of going as you've always gone?
I think I'm trying to go as I've always gone, and just I've actually turned to writing more horror than I was previously. So go figure. Actually, horror has really picked up in terms of popularity with readers as well.
Yeah, actually, a couple of years ago, when I put out one of my novels, it was early in the pandemic. I just was filled with so much angst and rage about what had happened that I just banged out this short piece, and it turned out to be probably one of the most intense things that short pieces of fiction I've ever read. When someone said to me, he's like, "You made me cry." I'm like, well, okay. People don't usually say that about stuff that I write, but who knows, the way it kind of seeps into us all. What about you, Amy? Has the last couple of years influenced your writing in any way, or is it same as always?
Well, the thing that happened to me at the height of the pandemic, Russ, is I got waylaid on Long Island for 2 years. And I was isolated. All my friends were in the city. I don't drive. And so it made me more prolific because there wasn't much to do after my workday. So I got a lot of writing done. So in a way, it was a positive, you know, it had already happened, the pandemic. So I made the most of it. And I cranked out a lot of couple of novellas and a lot of short stories, some microfiction, poetry. Got a lot of it published. Some is coming next year. So.
Oh, right on. All right. So to varying degrees, suspense and building tension is as important, if not more so, than actually showcasing, you know, the horror event or the dark fiction. How do you like to build that tension in your stories? Just Amy, we'll stick with you.
How I build the tension depends on where I find myself with the characters and how quickly I want to reveal the gory, glorious ending. And again, that depends on the subgenre I'm writing in. My ghost story and even in the grave is subtle up until the end without wanting to ruin anything. And my dystopian novella, it really builds, but it builds at a level that's not tedious, and then at the end there's the payoff.
How about you, Carol? Do you have a, you know, what's your sort of approach towards, you know, tension?
I like to call my writing twisted tales that touch the heart. And so I like to establish a relationship with a character that the reader is going to like. And then I do the little medicine dropper to add a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and a little bit more of weird stuff going on. So I like to do a slow burn and drop it in. And I think it's kind of an interesting point because you can do that with just about anything. Horror, in a way, is a flavor that we add to our writing that we can put into anything.
That's right. So when you, and it's an interesting way of describing it, because I sort of do things similarly. Whether it's and you write mostly short fiction. So within the confines of, let's call it 5,000-7,000 words, you know, you don't have a lot of, you know, a lot of runway. Mm. Is it more important to you to establish the, how early or how late do you start to establish the first sense of, you know what, there might be a problem here?
I think you need to do it fairly early on without giving away too much. In a recent story that I've written that I can't talk much about, I have a character who's out in the wilderness and a line of ants goes by at a time when you wouldn't expect them. It's like, well, that's weird, you know, so it's just enough to say, huh, that's unusual. And then, you know, that may repeat later on. And then you start to notice, you know, this is a trend. There's weird things going on here. So I think it's important to dribble it in just a little drop at the beginning, because if you wait till halfway through, like you say, you're out of room, you're out of runway.
So. What about you? Do you have a particular approach towards, you know, building that tension?
I'm finding, especially with the microfiction that I did a bunch of over the last year and a half, that making the reader feel safe right up front delivers a much more powerful punch at the end, especially if I only have that little space to work in. So I really like the hard twists at the end of stories. Of course, there is a method to that to make it work smoothly, but I really like to do that, and I do it unapologetically.
Okay, I am here to fuck with you. All right, there we go. All right, so for those who are watching or who watch later, who either are writing horror, dark fiction, or thinking about it, what are some mistakes? What are some pitfalls that you would suggest that they try to avoid? Carol.
I think one thing, particularly in short fiction, is having too many characters so that you don't get to focus deeply enough on who's actually important. And if we are trying to build a relationship between the reader and the character who is going to have these horrible things happen to him, they have to get invested. So they have to know the main character well enough.
All right. How about you, Heather?
Brevity is definitely important in something like that. So getting long-winded and over descriptive and flowery, just it slogs the story down so much. So if you want to have a bigger impact, you've got to cut a lot of that.
The purple prose, right?
Mhm.
Amy?
Yeah, less is more, and show don't tell. It's almost a cliche, but it definitely applies, especially for people who are dipping their toe into writing fiction.
So it's interesting though, because if you think about, there's actually some contradictions in what you're saying. On the one hand, brevity, but on the other hand, show don't tell. It takes longer to show than to tell. So how do you reconcile the desire to have brevity, but also to take enough time to show what you need to show?
Well, it's definitely a balancing act. It's a fine line, and I'm actually editing 2 crime novellas for a new publisher coming out next year. I can't reveal the publisher yet, but I am cutting a lot. I'm trimming a lot of fat because I was getting bogged down in descriptions that were just not advancing the story, for example. So
What are the so we talked a little bit about, the kinds of horror that you don't, and it just seems to be a consistency, kind of like, excessive gore doesn't seem to be all that popular, at least amongst you guys. How much is gore an element of the dark fiction and the horror that, is it an element that you think, let me rephrase. How do you infuse the gore without it being too gory? What do you have, a sort of, a specific or even a generalized sort of, guardrail of, this is okay, but that's too much? Or is it just purely, I just have to go by feel? Heather?
I think it is some of that. And also, if it's we'll just say anatomically, for example, if it's just a very unnatural weirdness that is happening with a character's body, I mean, that can be very dark and can get darker very quickly depending on the functionality of it. So I think that would probably be one of the approaches I would take to keep it as dark fiction versus the gore of horror.
Carol?
What's our question? How much gore and how do we fit it in? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, essentially. So, do you have sort of, guardrails for yourself about, this much gore gets what, gets across what I want. This is too much. That's not enough. Or is it sort of, I just have to kind of feel my way through it and it's just purely situational?
I'd say situational, but what I typically have done is, if I'm going to have gore in a story, it's in that last twist at the end, like Heather talks about. It's not all the way through where we're just hacking body parts off left and right. I try to save it for the maximum impact, I guess is the best way to put it.
Amy, what about you? What's your gore? What's your gore barometer here?
And Amy is gorier than I am. I know that much for sure, right,
yes.
Amy?
Yes, I am, but Carol, it does depend on the story, and gore has its place, as you're saying. If it's throughout the whole story, it just becomes normalized. And I do try to save it for towards the end of the story, like 38 Special in the Gore Fest anthology, because the reader has to relate to the characters, whether it's the protagonist and the antagonist, like why are they driven to be doing these things? There has to be a method to the madness, or else it doesn't make sense.
One question I wanted to ask, this is a little bit more, it has to do with maybe suspense, but it also falls into horror, certainly psychological horror. So I'm not sure if anyone's seen it, but Steven Spielberg's first movie was a TV movie called Duel. It was in the 70s, where a truck driver, this guy is just driving down a desert highway out in I think it was California, and this truck driver, faceless, just hunts him down. That's the whole movie. But we never know why, ever.
Yeah.
This guy is he's targeted because. How important is it to you, or is it not important to you, to provide the motivation for whether it's, an attacker, a ghoul, a demon, a ghost, whoever sort of, inflicting the darkness or the horror? How important is it for you to reveal why they're doing what they're doing? Or is it just enough that they're doing it? Heather.
Depends on the story. I've done it both ways, where I give you reasons and it's terrible. And I've had stories where I don't give you reasons and it's also terrible, because you want to know, like, the unknown can be absolutely terrifying. And there's no reconciling that.
Carol?
I think in the movie that you mentioned in Duel, the thing that was the most striking to me was that could have happened to anybody. I mean, that could have happened to me, just out in the middle of nowhere, and this thing starts happening. And the other thing that made it more frightening was that he had no way to know how to make it stop, because he didn't know what he might have done to have caused it. So it builds up the threat and the tension and the fear a lot more, because you have no idea what it is. Now, I don't think you can't do that in every story, because then everybody would get tired of that. So it was particularly powerful in that one. I think sometimes it plays on the reader's fear that, oh, I've done this kind of thing before. That's what made the bad guy mad. I could have, fallen into this. So that's another way to get the story to relate. So I think it depends on a story to story basis, just like Heather says.
Amy?
I agree with Carol and Heather. It does depend on the story and the plot. But more often than not, I do end up revealing the method to the madness, as I like to say. However, it's usually a twist, and it's not what the reader expects.
All right. So let me ask you, what, if anything, do you think is misunderstood about horror and dark fiction? Carol?
I think the thing that many people who are not familiar with it assume that horror is all body slasher and chainsaw massacres, and it's just so much more than that.
Amy?
Yes, I agree with Carol. People who are new to horror, they think of the cliches, they think of the slasher, they think of just ghost stories, but there's so many layers, as we touched upon. There's body horror, there's splatterpunk, there's psychological horror, there's the supernatural horror, not just ghosts, but like animals, like Pet Sematary, Stephen King, going way back.
Heather?
Yeah, I agree with Amy and Carol. I mean, one of the scariest stories I've ever read was A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. I mean, and you don't see any gore in that. You may or may not think it's coming, but it's awful. I read it a couple years ago. I'm still trying to work through that one.
Oh boy. All right. That was great. But now it's time for a special segment on the show where we spin the wheel. On the wheel are 7 possible categories. Wherever it lands is what you get. And the categories are Freddy versus Jason, Stranger in a Strange Land, Truth or Scare, Trick or Treat, The Reanimator, Desperately Dreaming Dexter, and the new favorite, Kick Him in the Junk. All right. Amy, you're up first. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Let's see. What we got? Round and round. Ready? No whammies. And for you, we got The Reanimator. All right. What do we got here? Okay. So you have died a gruesome death, but medical student Herbert West has offered to reanimate you with a scary serum. If taken, you have a 50-50 chance of returning to life completely normal or as a zombie-like creature. If, however, you choose to forego the serum, you have a 50-50 chance of going straight to hell. Do you want to be reanimated?
Yes, let's roll the dice.
Okay, all right. It's either I'm good to go or I'm gonna be a full-on zombie. I love it. All right, Heather, you're up next. You ready?
All right.
All right, what do we got? Heather gets. All right, truth or scare. First time this has ever come up.
All right.
All right, so you have to pick truth, or you have to pick truth, or you have to pick scare.
Scare.
All right, give me your best horror scream.
I can't. I'm in an apartment and my downstairs neighbor is working right now remotely.
All the better to talk. Come on, scare your neighbors.
No, can't do it.
Oh, all right. You
Want me to do a truth instead?
All right, you ready? All right,
Sure.
so for $10 million, would you kiss a dead person on the mouth for 30 seconds?
How long have they been dead?
A day.
Yes.
Ooh, all right. Wow, gruesome. All right. Taking one for the team. I love it. All right. And Carol. Well, Heather, I always knew you were a freaky chick, but now we really know.
Yeah.
All right.
Does
A
it,
lot of
was there
money.
any, was there any tongue though? That's what I'm wondering.
Always.
Right, yeah.
Always. All right. Oh, here we go. I've been waiting for this one to come up. Desperately dreaming Dexter. All right.
Ah,
So our favorite serial killer, Dexter Morgan, just returned for a new season in New Blood. If in reality, there was a serial killer who only targeted the worst, most violent criminals on earth, and there was no collateral damage to anybody else, would you be okay with a guy like Dexter killing them on his table and disposing of the bodies? Dexter, as he says, taking out the trash.
I'm gonna have to say no, because how do we know he's right?
Okay, fair enough. All right. All right. You're gonna let all those horrible people run free. Okay, remember, it's on your head.
Yeah. But where's the jury? You know?
I'm just well, he's judge, jury, and executioner.
The hung jury.
Right?
All right.
Right.
All right. So now we got a new section of the show where it's time to pick your poison. We have 4 choices, and in the next section, you got choices A, B, C, and D. And I'm not going to tell you what they are. All right, Carol, you're up first. Pick A, B, C, or D.
B.
B. B is truth serum. All right. So what do we got here? You ready?
Sure.
I'm going to ask you 10 questions. Answer quickly.
Okay.
All right. Favorite flavor ice cream?
Vanilla.
Pineapple on pizza, yay or nay?
Sure.
Bucket list destination, anywhere in the world.
Timbuktu.
Scariest movie you ever saw?
Poltergeist.
If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Keeping my brain acuity forever.
Okay. Do you play any musical instruments? If not, which one if you could?
Guitar in 1968. Does that count?
Do you play now?
No.
Would you if you could?
Yeah.
All right. You can only have one. Wealth
Okay.
or friendship?
Friendship.
Cats or dogs?
Cats.
Yes. You can see a live performance, sports, music, theater, whatever. Any seat, any venue. What's your choice?
Music.
Specifically.
Oh, I would go back in time and watch the Grateful Dead again.
Oh, where?
Englishtown.
Okay. I saw them once in Buffalo in 1992 from what I remember. Okay.
If you remember, you weren't really there.
Well, I was barely there. Okay. Most impactful, where were you then moment?
What does that mean?
So in your lifetime, there are these, where were you then moments? What was the most impactful? What
Oh,
was the most impactful for you?
the first moon landing.
First moon landing. Wow, good one. All right, Heather, you're up next. So you got A, C, or D.
C.
C. And C is, what do we got? Ooh, this is another good one. All right, so this is one of our newer options here. So this one, and it has a big windup. So you got to bear with me on this one. All right, you ready? It's all or nothing, or steady as she goes. I'm going to give you two options that will define the rest of your career. And you can only pick one. And the options are, your next book is an international bestseller. You win every award there is. You make tons of money. Your book gets made into a movie that wins the Academy Award for Best Picture. You can ride this success forever. You will always be that writer. However, every book you write after that one, and I'm talking every single one, is an absolute dumpster fire, critically trashed and a commercial zero. You are called a washed up hack who can no longer even string together two cohesive sentences. Or you keep writing as you've always done. You're generally well respected, but and however much money you've made to this point, it's never going to get more than that. If it were up to you, given those two choices, which career path do you pick? All or nothing, or steady as she goes?
You know, steady as she goes has been working all right for me so far. So let's just stay the course.
All right, giving it the brass ring, fair enough. All right, Amy, so you got A or D?
Let's live dangerously and go with D.
D is thick. All right, we're going to find out if you have thick skin.
Okay.
All right. So as writers, when we put our work out there and ourselves, criticism of all kinds comes with it. The good, the bad, and everything in between. How do you honestly feel about reviews? Do you take them to heart? Do you let them roll off you, or do some stick with you more than others?
For the most part, I let them roll off of me, but if I do happen to stumble across a 1-star review of one of my books or an anthology I have a story in, I'll read it over, but I won't take it personally. Usually people who give 1-star reviews want attention.
Fair enough. All right. So we've got a couple of minutes. We're going to take some questions from the audience. We've got one here. Who are the female writers of horror and dark fantasy who inspire you? And who are your go-to writers as a reader? Amy.
Joyce Carol Oates. I'm probably going to say her name incorrectly. Sina Paleo. And Haley Piper does a lot of great stuff. Gwendolyn Keist. Those would be the top bunch for me.
All right. Heather?
As far as horror writers, Mary Shelley's one of my new favorites. I know, late bloomer. I'm also a newbie to Hawthorne. I love Hawthorne. As far as horror, Poe also. Non-horror, I love P.G. Wodehouse.
Okay. Carol?
I would say Shirley Jackson, if we're going to go with the classics. You know, what a way to draw you in the lottery and then turn the tail at the end. And Lee Murray writes fantastic stuff. Rena Mason, Sarah Tatlinger has really brutal and amazing stuff that sucks you in, poetry as well as her prose. And Nicole Givens-Kurtz, L. Marie Wood, a bunch of folks.
All right, so I'm going to ask you, there's one question I didn't get to earlier. This could be from a novel, it could be from a short story, it could be from a movie. And again, we're sticking with dark fiction and horror. What's one specific, it's a moment, it's a scene, that once it pierced your soul and it's never let go? What's one that it just stays with you forever? Heather.
Just recently made the mistake of starting to watch the movie 13 with Jason Statham. And there's a scene with a bunch of guys who are pulled into a massive Russian roulette. And that was absolutely destroying to my brain. And I can't get rid of that.
Amy.
Well, I was raised Catholic, so I'd have to say The Exorcist when the Regan, whatever the character's name is, when she's possessed and her head just turns around the full 180, and I'm just like,
It's very hard to get over the pea soup, man.
It is, yeah, and the pea soup, yeah.
Oh, God, that was awful.
Mhm.
You could almost like feel like the steam in it too. It was just
Yes, it was very
so awful.
tastefully done, pun intended.
Carol.
This one isn't so much horrifying, but just like, oh my God, at the end of The Sixth Sense. And I think I can talk about that because it's been out for a
Yes.
while, you know, but when we find out, oh, I thought I knew what was going on the whole time, and
Boy, was I
they
wrong.
played me. They played me. Yeah.
Yes, yes, they did. Yes, they did. Okay, so I'm gonna now share my screen. And so I want everyone just to bear with me for a minute. Hopefully I will do this properly. I don't always. So if I don't, you'll have to yell at me. Okay.
Technology is always fun.
Yes.
Mhm.
All right. So what do we got here? We have. So Heather, what am I looking at here?
So 366 Tales Stories Year Round is 366 one-page micro stories. I started that December 15th of 2020 and finished it middle of last year. And all genres, everything you can imagine and stuff that you can't is in this book. It is set up so there's a story each day of the year. You can read them chronologically. You can skip around, read your favorite dates, however you want to do it. It should be out in time for you to start January 1st.
So I've seen a bunch of them as you've posted it. What was your inspiration to do this?
Because when the pandemic started, my productivity just went to hell. I could not write anything. And by the end of 2020, I was like, I've lost so much time for writing. I have to do something, at least one page a day. I can do one page. And I got several stories into it. And I was like, I'll just do one for a whole year. Well, it's a lot harder to come up with over 300 story ideas than you would think, but I did it.
All right, right. Rock on. I encourage everyone to check it out. All right. So what do we got here?
This is Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. This is the best of Omnibus 12 edition. And I have a sci-fi horror story called EV-2000 Is Technology Gone Awry? Set in the near future. A mad scientist convinces his wife to be the guinea pig for an automated blood donation center, which extracts her DNA to experience emotions, and all hell breaks loose. And there's a couple of twists. It was fun to write. And as a bonus, this edition is headed for the moon. It's going to be part of the Lunar Codex, which is going to be a time capsule. Yes, and funny little story. I only know that because Teal James Glenn on one of his virtual panels mentioned it, and Stephen Van Patten from our HWNY chapter also have stories in this edition. So it's very exciting.
Wow, that's fantastic. Congratulations.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Carol.
This is the cover from Even in the Grave, the ghost anthology that James Chambers and I have co-edited. And Amy has a story in here, as we've mentioned. It's a gorgeous cover by Lynn Hanson, who does fabulous, fabulous horror stuff. It's releasing July 1st, and it's out from eSpec Books. Can be found on Amazon and places books are sold.
Awesome. All right. So as for me, I will encourage you. Let me see if I have another image. I don't know if this came. No, it didn't play. All right. I'm going to encourage you to check out my dark fiction noir novella project, Murder in Montague Falls, with my partners in crime, Sawney Hatton and Patrick Thomas. There are 3 noir novellas. They're all set in the same fictional town of Montague Falls. The protagonists are all teenagers. They went to the same high school, but the stories take place in 3 different decades. In the first one, which is mine, Red Ink, it's set in the 1980s, where a paperboy believes, rightly or wrongly, that he sees one of his customers, when he's collecting one night, sees one of his customers get murdered. And after hemming and hawing about what to do, decides to investigate the crime himself, to some fairly awkward results. The second story is by Sawney Hatton, called The Devil's Delinquents. And this is the one that's most horror themed. It's set during the 90s, during the Satanic Panic, where these three teens are kind of caught in a love triangle. There's the one femme fatale, I suppose, and the two guys are kind of like pining after her, and she draws them deeper and deeper into pentagram and the dark arts. And as these things typically do, especially with teenagers, they take a fairly unfortunate turn. And then finally, the last story from Patrick Thomas is actually a kind of classic noir set in the 1950s, where a sultry high school teacher seduces one of her students in the hopes that he will murder her husband. They're all standalone stories. They kind of graze upon each other, but you can read them individually. Murder in Montague Falls is available on Amazon and published by Crazy 8 Press. And if you want a signed copy, you can order one from me directly, or you can pick one up, as I'll be doing several conventions throughout the year. All right, so that's our show. I want to thank our guests, Amy and Carol and Heather, for stopping by for a great hour. And I want to thank everyone who's watching at home. I'm your host, Russ Colchamiro, and I'll see you all next week. Thanks a lot and take care, everyone. Bye now.